All right, it's time for another prediction video, and up today, the Georgia Bulldogs. I'm pretty excited about this one. I know you are too. I know you're excited to hear my thoughts on Georgia. Before we get to the video, though, tomorrow is going to have to be the deadline to add teams over on the Patreon page. I made that post about 2 months ago now, asking about these prediction videos, and you guys and girls have been commenting teams over there that you want to see me do. I sat down today and looked through the list. There's still like 25 teams on that Patreon list that I haven't done yet, and the college football season is like 3 weeks away, 4 weeks away, I guess. So I'm going to have to cut off the deadline for submissions over on the Patreon page at tomorrow, or else I'm just going to run out of time, and I'm not going to be able to finish the Patreon list. Now, hopefully by cutting it off now, we'll get through that entire list over on Patreon, and then I'll have a list of teams that are left over that I haven't done yet, and I'll have maybe a few days or a week or so to sort of fill in the blanks on some teams that I wanted to do that nobody left over on the Patreon page, or suggestions from the YouTube comment section, or whatever the case. But let's get to it. The Georgia Bulldogs. Yeah, good morning, that is Uncle Lou here. Yeah, that's right, it's me, Uncle Lou, live on LouTube for you. Thanks for watching. Really appreciate it also, in addition to that as well. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you're not already. I post college football videos almost every single day of the year, and believe it or not, some of them are even watchable. I don't know about this one. You can let me know in the comments down below at the end what you thought about this video and how it went. We're going to do this mostly the same way we always do it. We'll wrap up last year, look forward to this year. Who did Georgia lose? Who's coming back? What about coaching changes? Transfer portal stuff, key losses, any weaknesses on either side of the ball, that kind of thing. And then we'll put the schedule up on the screen, and I'll kind of go through it game by game, and I'll give you a winner and a loser for every single week. Now, every year when I do this Georgia video, I get a lot of the same comments. Well, this guy's a Georgia fan. You can't listen to anything he says. I get it, and that's fine if you fall into that camp of people who believe that. I went back and looked at the Georgia predictions I'd done over the last few years, and you could be the judge of how you think I'm doing on these predictions. I'm just going to give you the numbers. So last year, 2022, I predicted Georgia to go 12-0. No. I actually predicted Georgia to go 11-1 last year. I looked at this wrong. I predicted Georgia to go 11-1 last year with a loss on the road at Mississippi State. Now, of course, they went 12-0. They beat Mississippi State, although it was close at halftime. It was, I think, 17-12 at halftime, and then Georgia ended up winning big 45-19. So I was one game off last year. So no, I do not pick Georgia to go undefeated or 12-0 every single year, and you'll see that here. So last year I had them at 11-1. They went 12-0. I was one game off. What about the year before that, 2021? I had Georgia at 12-0 in 2021, and they went 12-0 in 2021. So I got it dead on that year. 2020 was a little weird. I actually started doing prediction videos in 2020, I think around the end of May, beginning of June. And then, of course, you remember that was the COVID year. The schedules got completely changed. There was a while there in June or July where we weren't sure we'd have college football at all. And then, they said, well, we'll play, but no non-con games. And then the Big Ten said, well, we'll play, but only 5 or 6 regular season games. So I went back and looked. I did like maybe 10 or 15 prediction videos, and then all the COVID stuff happened, and I just stopped doing them. So I never actually did a Georgia prediction video in 2020, so we don't know how right or wrong I would have been in that particular year. They lost 2 regular season games that year to Alabama and Florida. Year before that, 2019, I predicted Georgia to go 12-0. They went 11-1. In my own defense, the one loss was at home to a 3-win South Carolina team. A terrible team, a team that Georgia should have beat by 20 or 30 points. If you remember that game, Jake Fromm had 3 turnovers. 3 or 4. Might have had 4. 3 interceptions and a fumble. Hot Rod Rodrigo Blankenship, who was as reliable of a field goal kicker as Georgia's ever had, missed multiple field goals. Georgia actually lost that game by only giving up 1 defensive touchdown. So it was just a nightmare of a game for Georgia. But they did lose. That put me 1 game off. I had them at 12-0. They went 11-1. 2018, the year before that, I had Georgia at 11-1 with a loss on the road at LSU. Georgia went 11-1 with a loss on the road at LSU. So I've not been more than 1 game off in terms of Georgia's record in all of the years that I've been doing this, and I've been dead on a couple of times too, including predicting which teams they would lose to. So no, I don't predict Georgia to go 12-0 every year. But look, here's the reality. If you go back and look at all of the predictions I've done for teams like Bama, Georgia, Clemson, Ohio State, Oklahoma when they were on their run, whatever, These are teams that don't lose but 1 or 2 games a year every year. So, I mean, it's just ridiculous to come out and make a 7-5 prediction for a team like that. Georgia falls into that same category. Just so happens I'm a Georgia fan, so I catch a lot of slack for it. But based on the comments I've got all off season from just about everybody, I'm assuming most people that are watching this video are predicting Georgia to go 12-0 because all I've heard is how easy Georgia's schedule is and they don't play anybody. So we'll see if I agree with those people as far as Georgia goes going 12-0 when we get to the end of the video and I put the schedule up on the screen. Anyway, we're going to start with some numbers like we always do, looking at Georgia heading into 2023. We'll wrap up last year, and then we'll move forward to next year. So where do I have Georgia ranked heading into 2023? I've got them number 1. I do 3 off-season polls. I do one after signing day in February. I do one after the spring games end in April. That's the most recent one I've done. I do a third and final off-season or preseason ranking the first week of August. So that'll be coming out probably end of next week or beginning of the week after that. So I do have Georgia at number 1 right now in my preseason ranking. Nationally, if you look at some of the rankings that are around, whether you're talking about some of the big name ones like ESPN or Fox Sports or Yahoo or Sports Illustrated or whatever, or some of the smaller YouTube channels or blogs or whatever you want to look at, Georgia's anywhere from 1 to 3. Primarily, they're ranked number 1. The majority of polls you look at or rankings you look at, no matter who's putting the rankings out, most of them have Georgia at 1. There are a few more that have them at 2, and then a few even less that have them at 3. I've not seen Georgia ranked any lower than 3 in any ranking anywhere. How many wins is Georgia expected to get for 2023? This is a Vegas betting number. So for people who like to bet on regular season wins that a team will have, right? Yeah, keep in mind there's a 12-game regular season schedule. So this isn't including any potential conference championship games, bowl games, playoffs, anything like that. It's just a bet on the regular season win total. The win total for Georgia for betting purposes in 2023 is 11.5. I know you can't win 11.5 games. Again, this is a betting number. So if you think Georgia's going to win more than 11.5 games, in other words, if you think they're going undefeated, 12-0, you would bet the over on 11.5. If you think they're going to do worse than that, 10-2, 9-3, or anything worse, you would bet under 11.5. So 11.5 is the expected number of wins for UGA in 2023. Heisman Trophy candidates for Georgia. Well, quarterbacks always get a bump in odds because of the position they play, right? The Heisman Trophy has kind of turned into a quarterback award. There are a few exceptions over the last 25 years, but it's primarily a quarterback award. So because of that, quarterbacks on each team tend to get better odds than players at other positions. There's not a person alive that thinks the quarterback for Georgia, whoever that ends up being, is the best player on Georgia's team. I mean, that's just insanity, right? I don't care how good Carson Beck or whoever ends up being, they're not going to be the best player on this team. That honor goes to Brock Bowers. But Carson Beck has the best Heisman odds of any player currently on Georgia's roster. He's right now 12th in the Heisman odds at plus 2,000. Again, that's a betting number. So you bet $100 on Carson Beck to win the Heisman. If he wins it, you win $2,000. That's what plus 2,000 means. Brock Bowers, of course, is on the Heisman list at plus 6,500. That's a long shot worth making a bet on, in my opinion. You know, him, Marvin Harrison, Perkins from LSU. I think those are probably the 3 best players in football this year that don't play quarterback. Obviously, you've got Caleb Williams, who won the Heisman last year. He's first in the odds, though. I'm talking about if you're looking for a long shot bet that could potentially pay off and really line your pocket, Brock Bowers, Marvin Harrison, and Harold Perkins at LSU all have long shot odds. All 3 I believe, are 3 of the best 5 players in all of college football, but unlikely to win the Heisman. That's why the odds are what they are. What about winning the conference? Georgia's odds to win the SEC in 2023 are minus 115. That's the best odds of any team in the SEC. So they're the overwhelming favorite to win the SEC. Bama has the next best odds all the way up at plus 300. Then LSU at plus 450. And Texas A&M and Tennessee are tied after that a long ways off at plus 1,400. Odds to win a national championship for what would be a 3rd straight season for Georgia, just something that none of us have seen in our lifetime. You got to go back, of course, to the 30s, the last time a team won 3 straight national titles, that being Minnesota. But Georgia is the favorite to win the national title, at least the betting favorite right now to win the national title in 2023. Odds plus 215. Bama, second best odds at plus 600. Ohio State at plus 650. followed by Michigan in fourth place at plus 800. So those are the 4 betting favorites to win the national title. What Georgia do last year? What'd they lose? Who's coming back? Coaching changes, all that kind of thing. Let's talk about it. 15-0 last year, national title, ran through the regular season undefeated. A little bit of a scare on the road at Missouri midway through the season. Other than that, sort of a cakewalk through the regular season. Blew LSU out in the SEC title game. And then, of course, you had the Ohio State game, the Peach Bowl, the first round of the playoffs, which was an unbelievable game, one of the best playoff games we've ever seen. Georgia's been involved in 2 of the greatest playoff games of all time, the Rose Bowl in 2017 against Oklahoma and last year's Peach Bowl against Ohio State. Georgia came out ahead of both of those, beat Ohio State, advanced to the national title game where they beat TCU 65-7. Not only the worst defeat in playoff history, the worst defeat in the history of bowl games. We've been playing bowl games in college football for 100 years. That's the widest margin of victory in any bowl game in the history of bowl games. Just an absolutely dominating season for Georgia last year at 15-0. But they got some significant losses heading into 2023. We'll start on the offensive side of the ball. Offensive coordinator Todd Monken, probably the biggest loss for Georgia, is offensive coordinator Todd Monken. I think he's the best offensive coordinator Georgia's ever had. He's without a doubt the best offensive coordinator that Kirby Smart has ever had. His first 2 offensive coordinators, in my opinion, were complete duds. Chaney first, followed by Coley. I was not a fan of either one of those 2. Underperformed. Monken comes in, sort of reworks the offense, and we saw what happened the last 2 years. He is left to take another opportunity in the NFL, and Kirby chose to hire Mike Bobo from within. Bobo has been around forever, played for Georgia back in the 90s, bounced around coaching in the 2000s, winded up as offensive coordinator at Georgia under Mark Richt in the late 2000s. He was there for 8 or 9 years, I believe. Got a head coaching opportunity out at Colorado State. Didn't go well. Left there. Bounced around a couple of other SEC schools, South Carolina, Auburn, and, of course, has been at Georgia for the last few years as an offensive analyst, then an offensive coach, then assistant offensive coordinator, and now offensive coordinator. It's a risk. Georgia is a premier football program. They could have gone out and interviewed and probably gotten any offensive coordinator they wanted. Kirby chose not to do that as far as anyone knows. He didn't even make any phone calls, didn't conduct any interviews at all. The job was sort of just handed to Mike Bobo. We'll see if that was a good idea or a bad idea, but that's what happened. Bobo in, Monken out. Offensive players, of course, quarterback Stetson Bennett gone after what seems like an eternity. He was 6 years in college. He was a freshman way back in 2017 on Georgia's first national title team. They didn't win the national title, but made it to the national title game. Ended up winning the national title as Georgia's quarterback in 2021 and 2022. He's gone. Other than that, offensively, they don't really lose a lot. They lose McIntosh, a running back, but they've got 4 or 5 running backs that I think can get the job done. Clearly, anytime you change quarterbacks in college football, that comes with some questions, right? Particularly when you're changing to a guy who's never started a game, and whether it ends up being Carson Beck or someone else, whoever starts for Georgia in 2023 will be making the first start of their college career. Beck's been around forever. He's a 4-year guy. Expectations are high, but we'll see. Nevertheless, Bennett out, Beck in. Look over on the defensive side of the ball. Jalen Carter, of course, cannot be replaced. He was a dominant interior lineman. Prior to that, Georgia had Jordan Davis. There is nobody on Georgia's roster that can fill those shoes. Now, that doesn't mean they're lacking along the defensive line. Their defensive line is full of future NFL players. None of them are top 5 picks, though, which is basically what you got out of Jordan Davis and Jalen Carter. Jalen Carter's draft stock fell a little bit due to some off-the-field issues, but in terms of football talent, he was a top 5 talent. Georgia doesn't have a player that can replace what Jalen Carter was able to do. My opinion, the one that was the closest to potentially being able to do that was Bear Alexander. Georgia's had one of the best defenses on the planet the last couple of years. It's no real surprise. Do you have any idea how good you have to be to play significant time as a true freshman at the University of Georgia on the defensive side of the ball? And that's what Bear Alexander did. He left via the transfer portal. Another significant loss for Georgia this year. So they lose really their 2 most dominant interior defensive linemen, one to the NFL and Jalen Carter, one to the transfer portal with Bear Alexander, who wound up, of course, at Southern Cal. Offensively, they brought in some pieces, right? They bring in a couple of wide receivers to replace a couple of people they lost to the portal. I've mentioned Bear Alexander, but we also lost A.D. Mitchell, who's probably Georgia's most talented wide receiver. Now, he was hurt a lot last year, didn't play a whole lot. In fact, he played less snaps in the national title game than Marvin Harrison did, yet somehow Georgia still won the game. It's funny how that works. He, for whatever reason, decided to make the move to Texas. Georgia brings in Dominic Lovett from Missouri, sort of a smaller slot-type receiver, but he was Missouri's leading wide receiver last year. And they bring in Ra Thomas from Mississippi State, Mississippi State's leading receiver from last year. So to go out and poach not one but two leading receivers for their respective teams last year, one from Mississippi State, one from Mizzou. See how it works out. Georgia's wide receiver room doesn't have any true standout superstars, in my opinion. A typical, there's no, if you want to look at like a list of great Georgia wide receivers, right? You're, of course, starting with A.J. Green, moving on to maybe a George Pickens. There's nobody like that on this team. However, there are 4 or 5 really, really good wide receivers. Maybe the best group of wide receiver twos in the country when you talk about Ladd McConkey, Arian Smith, Marcus Rosemary-Jack Saint's a great possession receiver, right? You add to that a Dominic Lovett. You add to that a Ra Smith. I think Georgia's wide receivers will be okay. The biggest question, like we mentioned, for Georgia offensively is going to be Carson Beck. Or whoever ends up being the starting quarterback. Most people assume it's going to be Carson Beck. He's a 4-year guy. Behind him, you have Vandergriff in his 3rd year, and behind him, Gunnar Stockton in his 2nd year. Carson Beck is not going to be as mobile or as athletic in the pocket, moving around, extending plays, taking off, running, things like that as Stetson Bennett was. However, he's a much more polished passer. Most people that you talk to who are closer to the Georgia program, who are smarter about these sorts of X's and O's things than I am, will tell you Georgia's offense is most likely going to look a little bit different in 2023 versus what we've seen the past couple of years under Stetson Bennett. You saw a lot of 2 and sometimes even 3 wide receiver sets, taking advantage of, honestly, what was the most talented position group on the field with players like Brock Bowers and Darnell Washington. You add Oscar Delp to that last year. Lawson Lucky comes in this year. I think this year, with Stetson Bennett gone and so many potentially game-breaking wide receivers, I think you're going to see less of the 2 and 3 tight end sets and more of the 1 tight end and 2, 3, and 4 wide receivers, that kind of thing. It's going to be hard to sort of feed all these wide receivers, but one way to attempt to do that is maybe less 2 tight end sets. And you got to remember, Darnell Washington was a very unique player at the tight end position, right? He was almost like an extra offensive tackle who could run routes and catch the ball. So on running plays, short yardage situations, even short passes, you wanted Darnell Washington in the game as an extra blocker. He could run the short routes. He, huge catch radius because he was so tall, that kind of thing. No matter how good Oscar Delp or Lawson Lucky, the next 2 tight ends in line after Brock Bowers end up being, they're not going to give Georgia what Darnell Washington gave Georgia in terms of the blocking, in terms of the lined in tight, sort of an extra offensive tackle type of approach. I think for that reason, although Oscar Delp and Lawson Lucky, I think, will play, I think they will play more as sort of to give Brock Bowers a break in a 1 tight end set, as opposed to 70% of the time Georgia lining up with 2 or 3 tight ends, which is what it seemed like they did. Last year. Offensive line, Georgia returns 4 offensive linemen with starting experience. Technically lost 2 starters, but due to injuries, Georgia played multiple offensive linemen last year, so they returned 4 starting offensive linemen. And offensive line has been an area, Georgia's been recruiting in the top 3 for 6 years in a row, I believe now, multiple number 1 classes in there as well. Offensive line in particular has been one of the areas where Georgia has really hit it out of the park when it comes to recruiting. There's probably 8 to 10 offensive linemen on this team who Georgia would be comfortable starting. I think Georgia will have one of, if not the best offensive lines in all of college football. The center is back. The offensive line should be really, really good. Now they're going to be blocking for, and this has been kind of a point of contention between me and a few other Georgia fans this offseason. I don't think Georgia's running back room is bad by any stretch of the imagination. Georgia has been just completely spoiled with the string of running backs that they have had, really going back to about 2012. If you start coming up, just make a list in your head of running backs Georgia has had from 2012. And keep in mind, there's no gaps in this list I'm about to rattle off here. At least one of these running backs has been on the roster every single year since 2012. Todd Gurley, Keith Marshall, Nick Chubb, Sony Michel, DeAndre Swift, James Cook, Kenny McIntosh. Those are all NFL running backs. Now, Keith Marshall had some injuries, sort of derailed him. We got the news over this weekend that Sony Michel is retiring after 5 years in the NFL, but he's got 2 Super Bowl titles and a bunch of rushing yards. Nick Chubb is arguably the best running back in the NFL today, top 2 or 3 for sure. DeAndre Swift is having a good NFL career. Just the list of running backs that Georgia had is just absolutely insane over the last decade. The running backs that Georgia have now are not bad, but I don't think there's a single running back on Georgia's roster right now that lives up to any of those other names that I just mentioned. Particularly if you look at the last couple of years and what James Cook and then last year Kenny McIntosh was able to provide to the Georgia offense, it was a lot of like what you would typically refer to as like a third down type of running back. A lot of swing passes caught out of the backfield, a lot of screen passes, a lot of wheel routes ran by the running backs. They were used a lot in the passing game, particularly the short passing game, which is something Stetson Bennett excelled at. It seems like about 60% of the passes Stetson Bennett completed were at or behind the line of scrimmage. A hitch pass to Brock Bowers, a hitch pass to, Arian Smith or whatever the case, a bunch of swing passes to running back. We're sort of missing that with the running back position this year. And the running backs that we do have, like I said, although they're good, I don't think anybody would describe any running back on Georgia's roster right now as being like Nick Chubb or like Todd Gurley or like DeAndre Swift or like Sony Michel. They're good. I'm not sure any of them are great. And they've struggled to stay healthy. Kendall Milton, who's going into his 4th year, this is kind of his make or break year. A lot of talent coming out of high school, and we've seen it a lot of times on the field at the University of Georgia, but he has struggled with injuries every single year he's been at UGA. Branson Robinson was a true freshman last year, showed some promise. Again, nagging injury. Andrew Paul, who came in with Branson Robinson, blew his knee out before the season started last year. Dejon Edwards is actually Georgia's leading returning rusher, and he's the lowest ranked, rated, hyped, whatever, of all of Georgia's running backs. And he's been very, very consistent and very, very reliable. He obviously doesn't have the potential or the high-end talent of some of those other names, but he's been on the field, and he's been able to avoid injury. I think you'll see a lot of action in 2023. It's definitely going to be a running back by committee approach for Georgia. Georgia's offense should score 40 points a game again in 2023. They scored just over 40 points a game last year. And if you just look at the weapons around, and I know we're replacing the quarterback position, and, if it's not Carson Beck, then Brock Vandergriff. If it's not Brock Vandergriff, then Gunnar Stockton. One of those 3 quarterbacks needs to be good enough to win Georgia games. They're all 3 very highly rated quarterbacks out of high school. There's really no reason or excuse that Georgia's offense should take a step back. If it does, to me, that's solely on Mike Bobo, and he's going to have to be a one-and-done type of guy. You look at Clemson from a couple of years ago to last year, right? They promote Brandon Streeter. Last year, Clemson's offense just never got off the ground. Dabo made the tough decision, fired him after the 1 year. If for some reason Georgia's offense underperforms or disappoints this year, I think Mike Bobo will have to be the one that pays the price for that. You look over on the defensive side of the ball, I don't think there's anybody alive that questions a Kirby Smart defense at this point, but in case there is, we'll go over it a little bit. Yes, Georgia lost Jalen Carter to the NFL, Keely Ringo to the NFL, Christopher Smith to the NFL. So, 3 really good players from last year. Last year was a rebuilding year for Georgia defensively. The year before that, the 2021 Georgia defense, widely considered one of the best college football defenses of all time, lost 7 or 8 starters to the NFL draft, and people said, defense can take a big step back. People who've been paying attention to what was going on at Georgia knew that wasn't necessarily the case, and all Georgia did last year was come out and have a defense that was almost as good as that 2021 defense was, just a stifling defense for UGA. So, yeah, they lose a couple of key pieces, but Georgia has recruited at an insane level on that defensive side of the ball. They've got first-round NFL draft picks on all 3 levels of that defense, with the exception of maybe interior defensive line. Now, you talk about defensive end or pass rushing defensive end or edge player, Michael Williams. We'll talk about him in a second. So Georgia's just got absolute beasts everywhere on the field defensively. And if you think Georgia's not going to have a top 5 defense in 2023, then you either hate me, hate Georgia, or you're just completely football ignorant. The defensive line will be fine. You have names like Zion Logues, and Nazir Sackhouse, Tramel Walter, Warren Brinson. I mean, all these guys played last year. Jalen Carter got all the headlines. A lot of people talked about Bear Alexander because he was a true freshman, and it's just so hard to get on the field on Georgia's defense as a true freshman. But these are all upper-class guys, veteran guys, all with a ton of experience, all with some starting experience. I saw a projection the other day that had Georgia as having the best defensive line in college football. I don't know if that will pan out, if that'll end up being true at the end of the year, but it just goes to show you that people who pay attention understand the amount of talent that Georgia has. And losing a Jalen Carter, although it's not good, losing a Bear Alexander, although it's not good, is not going to have the negative impact or effect on a UGA that losing those caliber of players might have on your average team. Georgia's defensive line is going to be fine. Michael Williams on the outside is going to be a huge problem for everybody Georgia plays. Another guy that was so good last year, you just couldn't keep him off the field as a true freshman. Started the Oregon game week 1. Probably Georgia's best natural outside pass rusher. Could have double-digit sacks in 2023. He's going to be a problem and a nightmare for every single team Georgia plays. You look at the inside linebacker positions, both return. Smile Munden and John Dumas, JDJ, Pop Johnson. They both return. Dumas Johnson, people tend to talk about him the most, and he was, I guess, the captain of Georgia's defense last year, sort of the quarterback on that side of the field, make sure everybody's in the right spot, he calls plays, that kind of thing. I actually think Smile Munden has a little bit of a higher upside. He kind of reminds me a little bit of Roquan Smith was his ability to run sideline to sideline. I would watch for Smile Munden to have a huge year in 2023. When you look back in the secondary again, a true freshman last year that was so good you couldn't keep him off the field, started the Oregon game, Malachi Starks. He's back at a safety position. You lose Christopher Smith, and that hurts. That was a guy been around, again, one of these guys been around forever and was sort of a quarterback of the back end of the defense. So losing him is going to hurt. You need sort of a new leader on the back end. It could be Michael Williams. But keep your eye on Javon Bullard. That's a name most people know from the Ohio State game. He was the player involved in the hit on Marvin Harrison. He actually won MVP of that Peach Bowl and then went on to win MVP of the national championship game as well. He played what Georgia calls the star position last year, which is kind of like their fifth defensive back. It's sort of a hybrid safety linebacker type position. There's a lot of people who expect him to move back to safety in 2023 and line up back there, sort of take Christopher Smith's spot from last year to true safety position. We'll see. He was really, really good last year at that star position. So if they do decide to move him back to that safety position, I hope they've got something in mind, somebody that can step into the star position, which Javon Bullard played last year, to give us what Javon Bullard gave us from that star position last year. Maybe that's Tyke Smith from West Virginia, a guy who's been around for a couple of years and have battled some injuries, expected to play this year. Kamari Lassiter returns at one of the cornerback positions, a possible first-round draft pick. We'll see how he does this year. He played really, really good opposite Kelee Ringo last year. So we'll see. But Georgia returns 3 starters in the secondary, both inside linebackers, and their entire defensive line is starting experience. Georgia's going to have a top 5 defense again. All right, here we go. Let's put Georgia's schedule up on the screen. We're going to go through it, and I'm going to give you a winner and a loser for every single week. We'll try to come up with an overall record for UGA. Told you at the beginning I was going to do this one a little bit different. Georgia's going 12-0. Georgia's not going to lose a game in the regular season. There are a couple of potential hiccups or landmines, I'll admit, and what I'm going to do is just talk about those. So rather than go through this thing game by game, because, look, Georgia's going to be a massive favorite in 10 or 11 of their games. I'm talking close to a 20-point favorite or more in probably 10 or 11 of their games, the Tennessee game being the only exception. Right now, they're favored, depending on where you look, between 7 and 10 points on the road at Tennessee late in the year. So, of course, a lot has been made about Georgia's non-con schedule, so we'll talk about that first. Georgia originally had Oklahoma scheduled this season on the road at Oklahoma. This is a game that was scheduled 5 years ago, way before anybody was ever talking anything about Texas or Oklahoma coming to the SEC. Around that same time, Bama and Texas also signed a home-and-home series, and there's been a lot of talk and a lot of questions about why was Bama and Texas able to play and complete their series, but Georgia had to cancel on Oklahoma. I've explained it a million times. I'm going to explain it one more time. College football schedules are made years and years and years and years and years in advance. Now, this is something I have a little bit of a problem with. I think it's ridiculous. Georgia's got games right now scheduled into 2032, 2033. It's just insane. We have no idea what college football is going to look like then. Why we're scheduling games that far out, I have no idea. So anyway, the The home and home between Georgia and Oklahoma, the non-conference series, home and home between Oklahoma and Georgia, that was scheduled 4 or 5 years ago. The first game of that series was scheduled to be played in 2023 on the road in Norman, Oklahoma. The second game of that series, where Oklahoma comes and plays at Georgia, was not scheduled to be played until 2029. Why they were scheduled so far apart, I've got no idea. It's anyone's guess. Again, it's just the way these schedules work, okay? Well, when Texas and Oklahoma made the decision to join the SEC and then made the decision to join the SEC 1 year early, 2024, that made it impossible for Georgia and Oklahoma to complete their home and home series before Oklahoma joins the SEC. And this was a non-con series. So what would have happened if no cancellations were made, if nothing was changed? Georgia would have traveled to Norman, Oklahoma this year and played Oklahoma. It would have been a non-con game. Next year, when Oklahoma joins the SEC, it becomes impossible for Oklahoma to then make that return trip to Athens as a non-con game. Now, I don't agree with canceling the game, but I understand the reasoning why. And I get it that people just want to trash talk and say Georgia's scared of Oklahoma. Look, if Georgia was playing Oklahoma week 1, how much do you think Georgia would be favored? Georgia would be a 3-touchdown favorite over Oklahoma. This was a terrible team last year in Brent Venables' first year. They gave up 30 points or more in half their games. They lost 49-0 to Texas. Now, I know this is a new year, and they're going to be better, and they're going to be this, and they're going to be that. And you might think that. I think that. I think Oklahoma's going to win more games this year than they did last year. They get 8 or 9 wins probably. But honestly, what do you think would happen if Georgia went to Norman, Oklahoma in week 1? What is it that all these people that are saying Georgia's schedule is terrible? I can tell you right now, because I've been doing this a long time. I've been on YouTube since 2013. So I've been doing this a long time. If Georgia was playing Oklahoma in week 1, and I came on here and bragged about what a great game this is, and Georgia's going to Oklahoma, and then the game was played, and we beat Oklahoma 37-10. You know what all you would be telling me? Look at Lou, bragging about beating a terrible Oklahoma team. Oh, whoopity-doo, you played Oklahoma when they got a coach that don't know what he's doing. They won 6 games last year, Woo. Nobody care you beat Oklahoma in week 1. That don't mean nothing. It means nothing. You still ain't played nobody. So that's the thing. You're acting like Georgia wouldn't have gone to Norman, Oklahoma and won that game by 20 or 30 points. You're acting like when that happened, you would have been impressed by it. No, you wouldn't. If that game was still on Georgia's schedule today, you'd be saying the same things about Georgia's schedule you're saying. Again, I don't think it should have been canceled either. Maybe it could have been moved to a neutral site. I mean, there seems like there could have been a way to work this thing out. And for whatever reason, Georgia decided not to do it. I'm not happy about it either. Believe me. Do you think I want to watch Georgia beat up on Ball State and UT Martin and UAB for a month? No, I don't. I much prefer the seasons where Georgia starts out with a Clemson like they did 2 years ago, or Oregon like they did last year, or where they played Notre Dame like they did in 2019, or where they played Notre Dame like they did in 2017, or when they played North Carolina like they did in 2016. And that's the point. Georgia has tried to schedule at least one big non-con game a year. And a lot of people forget that even though the Oklahoma game is gone, Georgia still has a Power 5 opponent on the roster. I understand Georgia Tech is terrible. That's not Georgia's fault, okay? Just like it's not Oklahoma's fault when Oklahoma State is terrible, okay? And it's not Oklahoma's fault when Texas has been in the gutter for a decade. It's not Oklahoma's fault that they play Texas every year, but they're in the gutter or whatever. So, look, Florida, terrible, not my fault. South Carolina, not very good, not my fault. Auburn, been in the toilet, not my fault. These are teams we play every year. We played Tennessee last year. They were ranked number 1 in the country. We blew them out. Who knows what's going to happen when we get to that game this year. So that's the non-con deal. But Georgia's winning all those non-con games by 1 million. The first conference game of the year. So 2 non-con games at home. Then South Carolina comes in. So we'll talk about that. South Carolina's a good team. They're a good team last year. Not great. Good. Spencer Rattler, up and down. Way too much down, though. Played better towards the end of the year and a win against Tennessee and then a win against Clemson, but very inconsistent throughout the year. He'll probably be a little bit better. South Carolina has absolutely no run defense at all. They've got no run game at all. They lost their best running back to Southern Cal, Marshawn Lloyd. They lost Jaheim Bell to Florida State. They lost a couple of key defensive players. Now, they've been recruiting better than normal, and their sort of talent level is on the rise. They're nowhere near Georgia. Georgia's blown them out a couple of years in a row. This is the first conference game for Georgia. It's the first game that the fans are going to care at all about. I can tell you that. It's probably the first game the team is going to care about. South Carolina's not coming into Athens and winning that game. They're not. Georgia's about a 3-touchdown favorite in that game. And to be honest with you, if I was going to bet that game right now, I'd take Georgia and lay the points. South Carolina's going to have a very difficult time moving the ball on Georgia. Spencer Rattler is good, but he doesn't have the weapons he needs. This isn't going to be an Ohio State situation. Spencer Rattler's not going to come out and go 40 or 45 or something like that for 350 yards and 3 touchdowns. That's just not going to happen. South Carolina doesn't have the pieces around that they need to do that. Georgia's going to dominate this game early on. By the second half, it'll be a snooze fest. I just don't see South Carolina being able to keep up with Georgia. They'll win there. The next opportunity, Georgia's got another one of the non-con games they'll win, so they're 4-0. The next thing that kind of worries some people, and this one does worry me. This one, as a Georgia fan, this one worries me. On the road at Auburn. I know Auburn's not very good. Talent-wise, they're not where they need to be. They've gotten some big recruiting wins over the last couple of weeks. One over Georgia, one just recently over Bama. That'll help them a couple of years down the road. But right now, they don't have the pieces they need. Hugh Freeze has proven he can beat good teams with subpar talent. But when he does it, he's usually got an elite-level quarterback. When he was at Ole Miss, he beat Alabama a couple of years in a row. He beat Georgia when he was at Ole Miss in 2016. Ole Miss, by the way, the only team Kirby hasn't beaten yet in the SEC, and they play later on a schedule. We'll get to it in a second. This game worries me because it's the first road game of the year, which means whoever Georgia's quarterback is, I believe it'll be Carson Beck, this is going to be his first road start. And Auburn, at most, will have one loss by this point in the season. If you go and you look at Auburn's schedule, it's a couple of nobodies and then a game against Texas A&M. I think Texas A&M probably beats Auburn and gives them the one loss, but so still, you're going into Jordan-Hare Stadium, and Alabama fans will back me up on this, and it's rare that me and Alabama fans agree on anything at all. Jordan-Hare is a very difficult place to play. And this isn't me trying to pump something up. Yeah, Mizzou, it's not difficult to play at Missouri. Georgia just went up there and shit the bed last year. Missouri's probably the easiest place to play in the SEC, maybe Vandy. But it can be extremely difficult to play on the road at Jordan-Hare when their crowd is in the game. And because this game is early in the year, because they're excited about having a new coach, which always breeds optimism, because I think they'll either be undefeated or maybe only have one loss, because Georgia's back-to-back defending national champions and will be undefeated and ranked number 1 when they come into this game, I think that crowd is going to show up week 5, I guess this is, at Jordan-Hare and Auburn, and they are going to be a problem. And if Carson Beck or the Georgia offense, or whoever's leading it, is not prepared or is unable to handle that crowd noise, this game is a potential trip-up game for Georgia. I can't predict Georgia to lose it, though. I just think talent-wise, Auburn's got a ways to go. And I mentioned Hugh Freeze beating Bama a couple of times when they were sort of on top of the college football world. If you look at Auburn's quarterback situation, it's just a complete mess right now. Robbie Ashford is not a quarterback. He's a wide receiver or a running back, in my opinion. You bring in Peyton Thorne from Michigan State, the worst Michigan State team we've seen in a long, long time last year. I just don't think Auburn and Hugh Freeze have the talent in 2023 to knock off of Georgia, even though if you were going to ask me to name 2 or 3 potential losses for Georgia, this would be on that list of 2 or 3. Georgia will breeze through the majority of its conference schedule. You're talking about teams like Vanderbilt, should be an easy win. Missouri, we get it home. I think Georgia, because of the way they played against Missouri last year, will come out and sort of try to prove a point in that one. And again, talent-wise, Missouri, just the odds are against them. I don't really see that game being a problem at home for Georgia. Kentucky at home, I honestly don't remember the last time Kentucky beat Georgia. It's been a long, long time. Kentucky's had some pretty good teams over the last 3 to 4 years. Georgia has handled them with little to no problem at all. And I don't expect it to be any different this year. The Florida game. I'm not high on Florida, nor is anyone else outside of a handful of delusional Florida fans. They're predicted to win about 5 games this season. If you think Auburn's quarterback situation is bad, you should look at Florida's. Their backup got arrested on some child pornography issues. They bring in Graham Mertz. The other guy, Jack Miller or whatever, that played in the bowl game, he's absolutely horrendous. Graham Mertz was terrible at Wisconsin with better talent than Florida has. I don't see Florida winning that one. Ole Miss late in the year, Tennessee late in the year. Obviously, on paper, when you look at Georgia's schedule, the Tennessee game stands out, right? Tennessee's going to be a top 10 team in almost every season, every single preseason ranking. Now, depending on how they do in some key games leading up to this Georgia game late in the year, that will determine, of course, what Tennessee's ranked at the time. They've got a big game on the road against Bama. They got a big game at home against Texas A&M, a revenge game at home against South Carolina. They play Kentucky. There are some potential landmines for Tennessee before this Georgia game, too. I would be absolutely shocked if between Georgia and Tennessee there was more than 3 losses when this game is played. Maybe Georgia, maybe through some sort of disaster, Georgia's got a loss or 2. Maybe through some sort of disaster, Tennessee's got a loss or 2. But if there is more than a combined 3 losses between these two teams when this game is played, I'll be absolutely shocked. I think Georgia won't have a problem getting up for the Tennessee game because not only is it the biggest game of the season, according to what I hear from everybody, and they've got to be hearing the same things, it's really the only game of the season for Georgia. Everybody I talk to talks about Georgia's cupcake schedule and how they're going to walk right through it without a problem. Tennessee being the only exception. I do think Tennessee will be good again in 2023. Their offense will be fine with Joe Milton. Maybe Joe Milton's not quite as good as Hendon Hooker, but because of the offense that Josh Heupel runs and because of the weapons they have at wide receiver, I think Tennessee's offense is going to be just as good as it was last year. I don't think they've improved very much defensively. I'll have to be proven wrong on that. And if you look at Josh Heupel and what he's done against Georgia with that offense over the last 2 years, Josh Heupel has scored a grand total of 3 touchdowns against Georgia in the last 2 years. So, yeah, they lit up Bama. They lit up Kentucky. They lit up Mizzou. For whatever reason, Georgia and that Kirby Smart defense may have figured out the Josh Heupel offense. We'll see. But that is obviously an opportunity for Georgia to lose. And then you got the Ole Miss game in Athens. Lane Kiffin comes in. I've sort of been talking about this over the last month or so. I'm not getting it with Lane Kiffin. I'm sorry. I'm just not. I do think he's an innovative offensive mind, but Ole Miss doesn't have the talent to compete and win 10-plus games in the SEC. They just don't. Look at, they start 7-0 last year, but you start looking at the schedule and you're like, okay, well, they're beating all these, they're beating the bad half of the SEC. What happens when they start to play the other teams? Well, we saw what happened. They lost 4 of their last 5 games. I mean, it just fell apart. They just completely fell apart. They've got a good ground game, but that's their problem when it comes to playing at Georgia. No one's running the ball on Georgia, and it's got nothing to do with this year's defense or last year's defense. No one's ran the ball on Georgia since 2016. It just hasn't happened. Go back and look at any game you want against anybody we've played. Michigan, who had one of the best ground games in the country 2 years ago, couldn't get a yard against Georgia in the Orange Bowl a couple of years ago. Bama's had some pretty good ground games, and they've even beaten Georgia a couple of times. It hadn't been from running the ball. It's been from throwing it. Look at last year, the closest Georgia came to losing, Ohio State. It wasn't because they were running the ball. It was C.J. Stroud had a game of his life. Joe Burrow in 2019 beat Georgia. Mac Jones in 2020 beat Georgia. Kyle Trask at Florida in 2020 beat Georgia. You got to be able to throw the ball. And as much as I like what Lane Kiffin can do offensively, the biggest win Lane Kiffin has in his career at Ole Miss is against Indiana in a Citrus Bowl or something that no one watched. And they just struggle to throw the ball. So I think Georgia wins. And there'll be some motivation there for Kirby, too. Like I mentioned, Ole Miss is the only team in the SEC that Kirby has not beaten. Lost Ole Miss on the road in 2016 to Hugh Freeze. I just don't see Georgia losing a game in 2023. Could I be wrong? Of course I could. I think the real question when it comes to Georgia goes back to the Vegas win total. Are they going to go 11-1 or are they going to go 12-0? If they go 11-1, who is that loss to? And does it keep them out of the SEC title game? That's an even bigger question and an even harder kind of riddle to try to solve. And then, in other words, what if Georgia goes 11-1 and their only loss is to Tennessee, but Tennessee's also 11-1 or 12-0, so Tennessee wins the East. Georgia doesn't even win their division. They're sitting there at 11-1. Their only loss is to a top 10 Tennessee team on the road, and they're back-to-back national champions. Well, they're probably getting into playoffs in that scenario. Ohio State got in last year with one loss to a top 10 team, even though they didn't win their division. We've seen Bama do it before. So those are the questions really to me about Georgia when it comes to the regular season in 2023. Is it going to be 11-1 or is it going to be 12-0? If it's 11-1, does that 11-1 keep them out of the SEC title game or not? Does Tennessee get past Bama, Texas A&M, and Kentucky? It's a tough stretch of games they have in the middle of the year so that they can get to the Georgia game with a chance to win the East? Or is the East already out of reach by the time that game is played? I mean, if Tennessee's got 2 losses and Georgia's got 0, then that game means nothing. Tennessee could beat Georgia by 1,000 points. Georgia would still win the East and go on to the SEC title game. So that's kind of how I look at the season this year for Georgia in 2023. 12-0. The first team in college football history to have 3 straight 12-0 seasons. Never been done before. Georgia went 12-0 in 2021 in the regular season. They went 12-0 in 2022 in the regular season. If they go 12-0 in the regular season in 2023, it will be the first time in college football history that has ever been accomplished. You have to remember, we haven't always been playing 12 regular season games, so that stat is not quite as impressive as it sounds. I think we started 12 regular season games back in 2006. What is going on with these lights back here? I don't know. Seizure warning. So that's not quite as impressive as it sounds, but no, I think it was 2005 or 2006 when we moved to a 12-game schedule. So what was that, 17 years ago? But no one's ever gone 12-0 for 3 consecutive regular seasons. Georgia has an opportunity to be the first team to do it. And, of course, if they were to win the national title this year, would be the first team since the 1930s to win 3 straight national titles. Anyway, there you go. Undefeated regular season for Georgia. Cry about it down below. Let me know where I'm wrong. Have a good morning.